Well, thank you very much for having me. I welcome you guys to ask me questions during the talk. I would rather be interrupted than lose anyone early on. You're also welcome to save questions to the end if that's what you prefer, okay? So I'm going to be talking about large earthquakes that can happen in the Pacific Northwest. So some of you might be familiar with this figure. This figure is showing the tectonic setting of the Pacific Northwest. And the reason we show this figure is because it really highlights the three different types of earthquakes that we can have here. So the first type of earthquake that I'm going to mention is the crustal earthquakes. So those are shallow faults, they're near the surface. Earthquakes that you might have heard of, there was a 900 AD Seattle Fault earthquake, that's a crustal fault. There's also the 1872 Lake Chelan earthquake, that's also a crustal fault. So we can have these shallow faults close to the surface, but the earthquakes that you're probably more familiar with are the deep earthquakes that are in the subducting slab here. So this is the Juan de Fuca plate subducting beneath North America. So earthquakes that were deep earthquakes that we've experienced here, there was one in 1949, 1965, and also the 2001 Nisqually earthquake. That was a deep earthquake. Okay, and then the third type of earthquake that we can have here is a megathrust earthquake. So this happens on the Cascadia Fault offshore. This is the one that people call the big one. Okay, so this is when this little patch here, so the subducting plate and North American plate all of a sudden lurch past each other, and that generates a very large earthquake. And that's the type of earthquake that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so we know that the Pacific Northwest, or I just told you that the Pacific Northwest is capable of having these three different types of earthquakes, but how frequent are they? How likely are they to happen? So we give these probabilities. We say, what is the chance of this earthquake happening in the next 50 years? I'm in my 30s, so I like to think of this as being, what is the chance of one of these earthquakes happening in my lifetime? So these crustal earthquakes, the shallow earthquakes, we estimate that there's a 15% chance of a magnitude 6.5 or above happening in the Puget Sound region in the next 50 years. The deep earthquakes, we know those are fairly frequent, right? We've seen at least 3 since the 1940s. So there's an 84% chance of another one of those happening in the next 50 years. So that's your Nisqually style earthquake. And we kind of know what those earthquakes are like, right? We've seen them happen. We experienced the 2001 earthquake. Damaging, but not necessarily terrible. Now the subduction zone earthquake, the magnitude 9, the big one, so we estimate that there's a 10 to 14% chance of one of these earthquakes happening in the next 50 years. And this is a big deal, because this is a big earthquake. This is 5,000 times more energy than these magnitude 6.5s than I was talking about. So even though that likelihood is a little bit lower, this is a really large earthquake. So it makes it really important that we try to understand what the impact would be here in the Pacific Northwest.
So the magnitudes of the first two are the same, greater than 6.5.
Right. Yeah, but they could, so like the Nisqually earthquake, for instance, was 6.8. So they have a range. Usually they're magnitude 6s or 7s. They don't get as big as the magnitude 9s, the megathrust earthquakes.
The threshold for those two types is the same.
Right.
Higher than 6.5.
Right, and we actually have little crustal earthquakes that are not included in this threshold all the time. So we have magnitude 2s and 3s every day, but people don't feel them. You would maybe feel a magnitude 3 if it was right beneath you, but that's pretty unlikely. So, any other questions? Okay, so before I dive into the science, I want to outline 3 questions that I'm going to try to address today to kind of help guide you along with my talk. So first, we're going to talk about how do we know that the Pacific Northwest is even capable of generating these magnitude 9 earthquakes, right? We haven't experienced one in our lifetime. How do we even know they exist? Next, I'll talk about what will happen during a magnitude 9 earthquake. And finally, I'll talk about how can we better understand and prepare for these great earthquakes so we don't panic. Okay, so first, how do we know that the Pacific Northwest is capable of an M9 earthquake? So in the year 1700, Japan was an advanced civilized society. And Japan has a lot of earthquakes. They had already made the association that sometimes they feel ground shaking, which is an earthquake, and then they experience flooding, which is a tsunami. So they had made that connection, earthquake and then tsunami. So in the year 1700, there was something in Japan that was later termed an orphan tsunami. So they experienced flooding that looked like a tsunami, but there was no earthquake ground shaking before it. So it didn't really make sense where that flooding, where that tsunami had come from. So this is actually, this is a rendition of some records that were kept in a village in Japan. And so it's kind of small text here, so I'll just read it to you. It essentially says there was something like a tsunami. How could it be? Because again, they hadn't experienced that earthquake. Okay, so it was an orphan tsunami. So this is the year 1700. So fast forward to the 1980s here in the Pacific Northwest. Before the 1980s, no one thought that the Pacific Northwest was capable of having these large earthquakes. Okay? And then a young Brian Atwater, who is still working with me at the USGS in Seattle, was digging along the coast. He was a geologist. He was digging into the trees. He was digging into the mud and trying to understand what had happened in the history of this coastline. And so one thing that Brian saw were these ghost forests. So this is essentially, it was a live forest at one point, and then something dramatic happened that caused all of these trees to die at the same time. And so actually during an earthquake, the coastline will drop down, and it'll drop down permanently, a few meters. So you can imagine if all of a sudden the coastline is 2 meters lower than it was before, seawater will come in, and it can inundate these forests. And these forests cannot live in salt water. So if you actually look at the tree rings for these trees and see when the last tree ring was, you can determine that all of these trees died in the same year. They died in the year 1700. Another thing Brian was finding, Brian actually does like to dig in the mud, so he was digging in these banks along the coastline, and he was noticing there were these layers of sand. And so what's happening there, so if you have a tsunami wave coming inland, so it's kind of like it's just like an ocean wave that we see at the beach, and it's carrying sand in it. You know how you get sand in your shoes in your bathing suit? It's kind of the same idea. The tsunami wave's carrying sand in. It drops the sand on the land. The tsunami wave recedes, but the sand is still there. And then things grow on top of it as time goes on. So each layer of sand that you're seeing here represents a tsunami that happened in the Pacific Northwest's past. So what you can do is you can dig into these sand layers, and you can take out a little piece of plant material or a piece of bark, and you can do carbon dating on it and get a year. And all those years come back to you around 1700. Okay, so we're seeing evidence that the land dropped down, potentially due to an earthquake, and that there was also tsunami happening in the same year. So finally, in the 1980s, people started to realize that this orphan tsunami that happened in Japan in the year 1700 was probably due to an earthquake here in the Pacific Northwest coast. Okay, so they finally had put two and two together. And this is really just about 40 years ago. So since then, we've actually been able to determine a lot more about this earthquake. Based on the size of the tsunami in Japan, we've estimated that it's between a magnitude 8.7 and 9.2 earthquake. I say magnitude 9 just because that's in the middle of that range, but it could be anywhere in there. We also can see by digging back into the geologic record that these earthquakes seem to occur roughly every 500 years. Any questions so far? Okay, so now that we know that an earthquake happened in the Pacific Northwest, magnitude 9, roughly magnitude 9, then the question becomes, well, what will happen if a magnitude 9 happens again? So the best thing that we can do is we can look at earthquakes that have happened elsewhere that are about that same size. So this is a list of the 5 largest recorded earthquakes in our history, in our recorded history. And you'll notice that 2 of these earthquakes, the 2004 Sumatra earthquake and the 2011 Japan earthquake, they were fairly recent. So we actually have a lot of data, a lot of photographs of what happened during these earthquakes. So they're a good indicator of what could potentially happen here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the 2011 magnitude 9 Japan earthquake as an example. So this was a magnitude 9 earthquake in northern Japan here in 2011. So as you can imagine, a magnitude 9 earthquake, there was very severe ground shaking. And of course, then there was an ensuing tsunami. This tsunami was devastating. At its maximum height, it was 130 feet high. That's hard for me to comprehend too. It's incredible. So the tsunami actually caused the vast majority of the devastation. Buildings in Japan are fairly well built. They could withstand the severe ground shaking. So these 16,000 dead or missing are primarily due to the tsunami. One of the really sad things about this earthquake, they didn't realize, sort of like we felt about Cascadia back before the 80s, they didn't think this area was capable of having such a large earthquake. They thought maybe it could have a magnitude 7, magnitude 8, but not a magnitude 9. And so therefore, they had tsunami evacuation routes that directed people to high ground that was deemed to be safe for a smaller tsunami, a smaller earthquake, a smaller tsunami. So people evacuated to those places, but those areas were not safe because the earthquake was larger than they expected, and therefore the tsunami was larger than they expected. Japan also had several nuclear facilities along the coast, so the tsunami wave took out cooling supplies and backup power supplies at some of those and caused 3 meltdowns at nuclear reactors. And overall, this resulted in $360 billion of damage, US dollars of damage. Okay. As I said, there's also some photographs. So this is a picture of one of the villages in northeast Japan. You can see fires here. Fires are a common consequence of earthquakes because of broken pipelines. This is an example just kind of showing the power of that 130-foot tsunami. You can just treat a large boat like a toy. Just another example. Okay, so then I do not want to put us in a place of fear. So then the question becomes, what can we do about this? What can we learn from these examples, and what can we do to help protect the Pacific Northwest? So that leads me to something called the M9 project. So we had a 4-year, $3 million project. It was a collaboration between the University of Washington and US Geological Survey. And the goal was to understand the impact of a magnitude 9 earthquake on the Pacific Northwest and to help us better prepare for it. So this is a little schematic that's supposed to help you understand how the project worked. So all of this project was based on these 3D supercomputer simulations that we ran of magnitude 9 earthquakes happening in the Pacific Northwest. And that's some of the results that I'll show you today. And then we took those computer simulations that I ran and we passed them on to people that would then say, okay, so what sort of tsunami would this earthquake have generated? What would the impact on buildings be? What would the potential for liquefaction and landslides be? And then finally, how can we take all this information and put it in a way that's useful to people and help communities prepare? So this project was much more than just me. It included seismologists, engineers, mathematicians, statisticians, as well as social scientists. It's a very large project that actually just wrapped up officially last month. Okay, so the goal of the M9 project, before I get into the results, again, we want to reduce the catastrophic potential of Cascadia earthquakes through advances in hazard assessment and planning. So for the hazard assessment part, what we ended up doing, we ran 50 different earthquake scenarios through supercomputer simulations in the Pacific Northwest. And what we really wanted to do was see the range of possibilities. So a magnitude 9 earthquake, I'll show you an example in a bit. Depending on where the earthquake starts, it could maybe be not fairly benign, or it could be very bad. So there's actually a lot of variability, even within a magnitude 9 earthquake, of how damaging it could be. And I'll show you some examples. That'll make more sense in a bit. And then in terms of planning, we wanted to assess the potential impact on buildings, landslides, liquefaction, communities, and I'll give you some examples of some of the work that my colleagues have been doing on that front. Any questions? Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm predating you or jumping the gun, but so what kind of tsunami would we experience on Bainbridge Island?
So I actually have a great simulation that will show that. But again, it can range. So even, I'm going to show you some examples that a magnitude 9 earthquake could result in fairly low levels of shaking, or it could result in fairly high levels of shaking, depending on some different features of that earthquake. And the same is true for the tsunami. It can range quite a bit, but I'll show you kind of a middle run simulation, and we'll focus in on Bainbridge Island later. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so again, my part in this project was running these 50 different scenario earthquake computer simulations. All of these simulations are now done. They're online. They're available for engineers, emergency managers, the public. So this is, I'm going to play an animation here of one of our M9 simulations, but let me talk you through a bit about what you're going to see. So the hypocenter is where the earthquake starts. So you're going to see seismic waves radiating outwards from that hypocenter. But the Cascadia Fault is all along the Pacific Northwest coast. So you're going to see this entire area rupturing and producing seismic waves. Okay. So here you see seismic waves starting to come outward from the hypocenter. This is going to be recording the ground shaking at each of these locations. So you see ground shaking has hit Portland. Now ground shaking is starting to hit Crescent City, then La Grande, and Seattle. And so kind of the height of these wiggles represents the strength of ground shaking. So the higher the wiggles, the stronger the ground shaking. So there's a couple things I want to point out, and I'm actually going to play that for you one more time. Okay, so seismic waves radiating outwards. Again, it's going to go across the entire fault, so both to the north and to the south. Seismic energy hitting Portland, hitting Crescent City. Okay, so a few things I want to mention. So you'll notice that Crescent City, say compared to Portland, has much stronger ground shaking. And that's because Crescent City is on the coast, so that megathrust, the fault, the actual fault, is offshore. And so any area that's along the coast is going to be closer to the fault, and therefore have stronger ground shaking. So that's why you see that strong ground shaking in Crescent City. Now, this is interesting. So the reason we put La Grande on this map, there's just, my understanding is there's a post office in La Grande. I've never been there. But it's the same distance away from the fault as Seattle. So you might expect that they would experience similar ground shaking. They're the same distance away from the earthquake. But you'll see here that Seattle experienced much higher ground shaking than La Grande. And that's because Seattle sits on top of a deep sedimentary basin, okay? And I'll talk a bit about that in the next slide. Okay, so takeaway number one is going to be about this deep sedimentary basin that both Seattle and Bainbridge Island sit on. So takeaway number one is that local geology significantly impacts the strength of your ground shaking. So as I just mentioned, Seattle sits on top of a deep sedimentary basin. So this is Seattle. This is supposed to be this soft sedimentary material. You can also think of this like a bowl of Jell-O. So if you shake that bowl of Jell-O, because the Jell-O inside the bowl is so weak, it's going to be shaking a lot more than the bowl itself, right? The Jell-O will wiggle a lot. And that's exactly what's happening here with this soft sediment that Seattle and that Bainbridge Island sits on top of. So you can have an earthquake, seismic waves coming in, they hit this soft, weak material, and it just starts to shake even more. Okay. So this is a geologic map. This is hard to read. I don't expect you to read it. All I want to point out is that all this yellow color here is weak sedimentary material. So this is the Puget Lowland. And so all of this area is going to have softer sediment that's going to shake more in an earthquake than the rest of the state. Now, the sedimentary basin has even more sediment than all of these yellow areas. So the more sediment you have, the stronger you shake. Okay, so this is an outline of the Seattle Basin. The reason I show this particularly for you guys is because I know that everyone's always interested in whether or not Bainbridge Island is in the Seattle Basin. And so this is our best outline of the Seattle Basin. Sometimes it's hard to tell exactly where it is underneath this. But you can see that most of Bainbridge Island is in the Seattle Basin. The southernmost part is maybe not, but most of it is. So pretty much every time whenever I talk about ground shaking in Seattle, you can pretty much expect that this part of Bainbridge Island will be experiencing the same thing. Any questions? Yeah.
The southern part of Bainbridge Island is where it lifted up so dramatically during that earthquake, and then it's outside where it's supposedly the Seattle base. Interesting.
Yeah, so I'm actually not.
Repeat the question?
Oh, so the question was about did you say it was uplift in the southern part of Bainbridge Island? And I actually don't know that much about that. So is there a specific date on that? So the thing that I'm thinking about, this is actually pretty far inland. So we don't expect too much uplift or subsidence in this area. But the southern edge of the Seattle Basin, essentially this red line, that is the Seattle Fault. And so any earthquake on the Seattle Fault would cause some uplift or subsidence. And so it's possible that some of that may be from a different earthquake, actually. Yeah.
So that southern part of the basin is a fault.
Yes. Yeah. So the other edges are not. But yes, so part of the reason the basin is actually there is because of the fault. Kind of causing this barrier where sediments from the glaciers can accumulate. Yes, so the southern edge here is a fault.
So that it was the last ice age that produced all that sediment before?
So it's both a combination of the tectonics, so the fact that we have a subduction zone, the fact that we have these crustal faults, and then also the glaciers bringing in that sedimentary material that could then settle in between these tectonics. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How does an island behave if differently?
It shouldn't behave any differently, actually. I mean, we actually don't even model the water in our computer simulations because it has a pretty minimal effect. So the fact that you're an island shouldn't make that much of a difference in terms of ground shaking. What it could make a difference in is the potential for tsunamis. So again, we'll show that animation of what a tsunami might look like for a magnitude 9 earthquake, but you can also get tsunamis from a Seattle Fault earthquake here in the Puget Sound region. So water makes a difference in terms of tsunami, not necessarily in terms of ground shaking. Anything else? Yeah?
What about Lahar from Mount Rainier?
The question was about Lahar from Mount Rainier. And so I don't think we actually know. There's very little evidence that there's a connection, say, between a magnitude 9 earthquake and an eruption in Lahar from Mount Rainier. They should be unrelated. I'm getting a little bit off topic, but the nice thing about volcanoes is that they generally give you warning signs before they erupt. So they're a little bit different from earthquakes. And I don't think we would expect that a Lahar would cause a significant tsunami in the Puget Sound region. Yes?
In an earlier slide, you showed kind of a nucleus, almost like on just off the coast,
Where everything starts. Mm-hmm.
It's a subduction zone that goes all the way down the coast. So how does that work?
Yeah, so the movement of the fault has to start in one spot. The whole fault doesn't jump all at once. So you can imagine it as just a little piece of the fault is starting to move, and then it causes the spot next to it to move, and then it causes the spot next to it to move, and it just keeps doing that until it actually makes the entire fault move. Does that make sense? So it's not all happening exactly at the same time. It takes maybe about 2 minutes or so. Yeah.
So in that simulation, you picked a spot on the coast where it would start, but it could start anywhere.
Yes. Yeah. You're stealing all my thunder. That's in my next few slides, because actually where it starts makes a big difference. Even if the entire fault still ruptures, that spot where it starts has a big impact. So I'll show you that in a minute.
Does it change when it reaches the end of the plate that's involved with the fault?
So the question was, does the width of the fault change at the end?
Yeah, the intensity of the earthquake.
It can, yes. That's my next slides, yeah. Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm just going to actually show you a quick zoom in on, before we get to all the great questions about where the earthquake starts. I'm just going to show you a zoom in of what the shaking looks like in this area of the Puget Lowlands, so where we have the sedimentary material. So this is a result from our simulations. So I've taken some of the numbers off here just so you can get the main point. So these colors are showing shaking intensity from a magnitude 9 earthquake. So white is, say, low intensity, red is high intensity. And so here you can see this is the Seattle Basin, and it's really lighting up as an area with strong ground shaking compared to the areas that are outside of that weak sedimentary material. This is the Tacoma Basin. So there's an even larger basin to the south. It gets a lot less attention because it doesn't encompass the city of Seattle. But it is, we actually are kind of shifting our focus down here next. Okay, so this is my last thing on basins. So we then work with the engineers to say, so this is what the supercomputer simulations predict for ground shaking. How is this going to impact your buildings? And so I'm going to play a simulation of, this is a 12-story building in the Seattle Basin, and this is a 12-story building in La Grande, so outside of the basin. And so the same earthquake, right? But we expect that there's going to be less shaking here because it's outside of the sediment, and there's going to be stronger shaking in Seattle because it's in that weak jello-like bowl. Okay, so let's see what happens to these buildings. So the earthquake is just starting. You can see the building starting to vibrate. Yeah, so this is permanent damage everywhere that you see a dark color. So this is the dark color are places where steel reinforcing is yielding, so steel is bending. And then everywhere you see a dot is a place where you likely have a column or wall failure. And you'll notice that there's a lot of damage to this building in Seattle, but essentially no damage to this building in La Grande. Same earthquake, it's just different geology. Okay, so takeaway number 2, there are a wide range of possible outcomes. This is getting to the point about where the earthquake starts. Okay, so the strength of the ground shaking is going to depend on a bunch of different parameters. So it depends on where the earthquake starts. I'll show you examples of that in a minute. It also depends on how close the earthquake ruptures, say, towards Seattle and towards Bainbridge Island. We don't exactly know where that fault stops eastward. And so that's going to make a difference. If it stops offshore, that'll result in less ground shaking than if the fault extends all the way beneath, say, Bainbridge Island. There's also these sticky patches on the fault. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but this is something that we saw in the Japan earthquake, that there were certain parts of the fault that created the strongest ground shaking. So the fault is kind of rough, it's not all uniform, and so different patches can generate more ground shaking than others. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about this hypocenter. So why does it matter where the earthquake starts? So this is the most science I'm going to throw at you tonight. I know it's late, but just bear with me for, say, 2 slides. So the reason the hypocenter matters is because of something called rupture directivity. So what this means is that shaking is strongest in the direction that the fault is rupturing. I tried to draw you a schematic here. So let's say this black line here is a fault. The earthquake starts at this star, and it's going to unzip the fault in this direction. So it's going to unzip so this part of the fault is going to move, then this part, then this part, then this part. So it's going to be moving to the right. And so all of the seismic waves that are getting generated as this fault ruptures, they're going to start to pile up on top of each other. This is essentially like a Doppler effect. Like when you hear an ambulance coming towards you, it sounds different than when the ambulance is moving away. So it's the same thing with the ground shaking. It's different when it's coming towards you versus when it's going away. So if the fault is unzipping in this direction, you're going to have stronger ground shaking in front of it, and you're going to have weaker ground shaking behind it. Okay? So I'm going to show you 2 magnitude 9 earthquake scenarios, and we'll see how this is different. So for one magnitude 9 earthquake scenario, this is the fault in these colors here. Red colors are areas where the fault slips more, blue colors are where it slips less, but this entire patch is moving. So the earthquake is going to start right here, kind of beneath inland Washington, and it's going to unzip the fault out towards the water. Okay? Now for the other scenario I'm going to show you, same exact magnitude, same exact pattern of how the fault moves, except it's going to start offshore, and it's going to unzip towards Washington. Okay? So these are the recordings in Bainbridge Island for each of these 2 magnitude 9 earthquake scenarios. And they're about a factor of 30 different. And again, both magnitude 9 earthquakes. So for this case, the fault is unzipping away from Bainbridge, weak ground shaking, so it's really not bad at all. And then for this case, the earthquake is unzipping towards you, so you're in front of the earthquake, all that energy is piling up, and that's what causes this really strong ground shaking. So it's an incredible amount of variability just by moving where the earthquake starts. So we can again look at our building models. So how is that going to impact a building? So again, this is going to be a building in Seattle for an earthquake that is unzipping away from us, so weak shaking. And this is going to be a building in Seattle where the earthquake is unzipping towards us, strong shaking. Yeah.
So what causes the energy to take a particular direction?
So it's where the fault is. So for instance, so all this colored area here is the fault. So if the earthquake starts here, it can't go eastward. There's no fault there for it to rupture. So it has to go west because that's where the fault is. So it's the geology of the fault.
Can it go either direction?
So it can certainly go, if the earthquake starts here, it can certainly go north, it can go west, it can go south, but it cannot go east because there's just no fault for it to move in that direction. The fault is only this colored area here. If we went east, the fault starts to, things start to get hot the deeper it gets into the earth, and it can't break and make an earthquake if you go to the east. Okay, let me play that building model. So again, this will be the weak shaking, this will be the strong shaking, both magnitude 9 earthquakes, but starting in different places. Okay, so again, you see a lot of damage to this building here, and not a whole lot of permanent damage to this building here. Okay? So it makes a big difference where that earthquake starts. Yeah.
What year building code? Is it the 80s building, 90s?
Oh yeah. So this is I believe like a modern 12-story, say the common kind of condo buildings that are being built in Seattle. So the recent one. So like it's a modern building. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes.
Do your research findings inform the policy and the building codes for the city?
Yes. So I'll talk about that in a bit. Okay. Okay, so ongoing research. So again, my part in this was the earthquake ground shaking, but there are a lot of other parts of this project. So the first one that I want to mention is the tsunami. So this isn't my tsunami simulation. This is one of my colleagues, Yang Wei. But obviously we can't talk about this magnitude 9 earthquake without talking about a tsunami. So this is I'm going to show you a tsunami simulation that Yang Wei did. So this is a magnitude 9 earthquake. This is just showing different maps. So this is showing you all of Cascadia. This is giving you a zoom in on Washington, and this is giving you a zoom in on the Puget Sound region and Bainbridge Island. So this might be of particular interest for you. So the pink colors are going to be, that's 6 meters, a 6-meter tsunami, so that's about 18 feet. And then, so that's the maximum for this particular simulation. Okay. So I'll play this, oops, I think I have to push it here. Okay, so you see tsunami wave coming in, hitting the western coast of Washington. You see it now coming in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This tells you the time since the earthquake. So it's been about an hour before the tsunami wave is making its way down Puget Sound, or down the strait. So now it's starting to get into Puget Sound. You see it going into the bays around Port Townsend. We're at 2 hours past the earthquake. Okay, so now just starting to get to Bainbridge Island. It looked like it was about a meter or two there. And you see these eddies, these waves kind of bounce around the coast for a long time. So the tsunami danger is not gone once the first wave passes. It lasts for a while. So I'm going to play that again. Oh, sorry. I was pointing at that, Sean. Okay, so you see the tsunami coming down the strait? So we're about an hour and a half past the earthquake. Now it's starting to come into the Puget Sound area. 2 hours past the earthquake. Yeah, so here we are. So about a meter for this particular simulation. But just like the ground shaking could vary from earthquake to earthquake, like I just showed you, the tsunami can vary from earthquake to earthquake. So this is one example, but an actual earthquake could be more, it could be less. All right, any questions? Does anyone want to see that one more time, or are you good? One more time, okay. Good. Okay, wave hitting the coast about 20 minutes after the earthquake happened. You can see also the waves bouncing off. So this is the tsunami going towards Japan out here. Okay, coming into Squim Bay, Port Townsend. We're about 2 hours past the earthquake. So the good thing about the Puget Sound is there will be a lot of warning. You'll feel the earthquake, you'll know. Okay? All right. Any questions on the tsunami simulation? Keeping in mind that this is not my simulation, but I'm happy to try to answer questions about it. Yes?
What was the magnitude of this particular?
This was a magnitude 9.
It was 9.
Yeah. Any other questions?
We always think of it as a backup, so does it, bounce off Bainbridge and bounce off Seattle?
Yeah, so there can be some sloshing effect that is more likely to happen for, say, a Seattle fault earthquake. So the sloshing effect is from very strong ground shaking. And the ground shaking in Seattle from a magnitude 9 will be strong. It won't be necessarily severe. So usually when we think of sloshing in the Puget Sound, we're usually thinking of, say, one of those crustal earthquakes, like a Seattle fault earthquake. But there could be some sloshing as well. I still think it would probably be, this would be the more significant effect, would be the tsunami. Yeah.
Does the wave diminish in size as it goes, or does it stay the same?
It does. It diminishes in size. So you could, I don't know if you could see, so when it was hitting the coast in this particular simulation, it was about 6 meters high or more. But by the time it got to the Puget Sound region, it was maybe 1 or 2 meters. So it does lose some strength as it goes further inland.
What's interesting is what it's doing there is not around the hook of it looking down.
Yeah, so what happens is when the waterways end, the tsunami kind of piles up a bit. So that's usually the most severe flooding or highest tsunami heights will be at the ends of waterways. But again, because this Puget Sound area is so far inland, it has died down a bit before it gets there. Yeah.
So you've done 50 simulations.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us some bounds on maximum effects of both the shaking and the tsunami?
I can for the tsunami because they haven't finished their part yet. The ground shaking part had to be done first. So we can give bounds. It's hard to, well, we can give bounds for a magnitude 9 earthquake, but remember when in the very beginning, when I said that the magnitude could have been anywhere from an 8.7 to a 9.2? And that's something that we hadn't done yet. So these computer simulations, each one took, so we ran 50 computer simulations, each one took 2 days. So if you ran those sequentially, that would be 100 days, but of course there were problems along the way. So it probably took about a year. We could run 8.7s, we could run 9.2s. I can give you the range for, say, a 9.0, but that doesn't help you if it ends up being an 8.7.
I was thinking about the bounds based on the different locations of the fault where the rupture first occurred.
Yeah, so what, I mean, are you looking for actual numbers? So, so I don't know if this is really going to be helpful. So maybe like the lowest amount of ground shaking that we've seen in Seattle is, say, 0.1 G. That's pretty low ground shaking. The highest is maybe more like 0.4 G, which is pretty severe damage to buildings. So it can, without actually having a figure to show you, it's a little bit hard to say, but it can range from being benign, like life will go on as normal the next day, to being severely damaging. It will take months to recover in Seattle.
And where are you building this wall at?
Oh, like life goes on, nothing happened. I mean, the Nisqually earthquake was a 6.8. It was much smaller than these magnitude 9s. So it's not even really comparable, honestly. And then the magnitude 9, the other big difference is, so the Nisqually earthquake was maybe a little bit south of Olympia, so mostly felt in the Washington area. Magnitude 9 is going to impact British Columbia. It's going to impact Washington, Oregon, Northern California. So it hurts the entire West Coast. So it makes, in my mind, the recovery operation a lot more difficult when you have all our neighbors also trying to get back on their feet. Yes?
Is it ever the case where an earthquake on one fault will trigger an earthquake on a different fault?
That's a big research question. We don't know. I mean, so as far as we can tell, the changes that, say, a magnitude 9 earthquake would cause aren't enough to trigger an earthquake on another fault. But of course, we see instances sometimes where earthquakes do seem to happen nearby in time to each other, nearby in time and space. And so that does make us wonder, but as far as we know, there shouldn't be enough energy to trigger an earthquake on another fault.
What about an earthquake and an eruption? Is there any correlation?
Yeah, so there's
Or vice versa?
certainly I haven't heard of an eruption triggering like a magnitude 9. There has, I think, after the 2011 Tohoku, Japan earthquake, there was maybe a little bit of activity at one of the volcanoes, but it wasn't a full-blown eruption. Again, I think this is kind of like the triggering question. There might be some small energy changes. Say if there's a large earthquake, there could be small energy changes on another fault. There could be small energy changes on a volcano, but it's very unlikely to actually trigger some full-blown large earthquake or large eruption. Yes?
Does the local geology, I mean, I'm thinking of a mile or quarter mile, have an effect on the magnitude or the frequency of shaking?
So the question was, does the local geology have an impact on the magnitude or frequency of the shaking? So magnitude we usually just reserve for describing the earthquake, so it doesn't have anything to do with the local geology. The local geology will impact the frequency. So for instance, the Seattle Basin has a natural frequency to it. So just like buildings have a natural frequency to them. So the Seattle Basin tends to amplify shaking at its natural frequency, which it seems to be around 3 seconds or so. That is also the natural frequency of like a 30-story building. So if you're a 30-story building and you're on top of a basin that amplifies 3-second energy, that's not great. But yes, so local geology does impact frequency.
We were talking about shaking, what about liquefaction?
Yeah, so I don't have a slide on it, unfortunately. But there were team members on this M9 project that then took these supercomputer simulations and then made maps of where we would expect liquefaction to happen and where we would expect landslides. Did I say landslides and liquefaction to happen? Those parts of the project are not complete yet. So all of this relied on getting these ground shaking estimates done first. So these other parts of the project are still happening. And so I don't have results to show you on those, but people are working on it.
Could you describe what liquefaction is?
Yeah, so liquefaction is when it's maybe a good analogy is to think of when you're standing in sand at the beach and you kind of wiggle your feet, and as the wave comes over, you kind of sink down into the sand. So it's the same idea when you have waterlogged soil or sand and then it gets shaken strongly during an earthquake. It loses its strength, and so things on top of it can sink down into it. So we say the soil has liquefied. And so that's liquefaction. So there's some, I don't have any of them, but there's some pictures of liquefaction from earthquakes in New Zealand. So you can essentially see cars that have sunk down about halfway into the ground. So half the car is now buried because it's sunk down. It almost starts to behave like quicksand. But we can predict where those areas might be because they have to be this weak, like sandy material, and it has to be full of water. So it's usually places that, like say around rivers, river mouths that are sandy and very saturated. So we have a good idea of what areas are prone to liquefaction just based on the geology before the earthquake happens. Yeah.
I find all this fascinating. I've read a couple books on earthquakes around here, and it's pretty heavy
Mhm.
stuff. But I'm looking at all this research. Okay, how do you take this research and protect the public?
Yeah, well,
What do you do with it? You got all these
let's keep going. So I'm going to show you, so there's a lot of efforts that are going on to try to bring the science to the public. And then there's also efforts within communities themselves, just trying to be better prepared for an earthquake. So I'm going to talk about I just have a few slides on two efforts that I am most familiar with. I'm sure there's many more that people in this room are more familiar with than I am. So I'm just going to talk about these two that I know about. But also, I don't have a slide on this, but one of our team members, Dan Abramson, he's a social scientist at the University of Washington. He's actually been doing workshops out on the coast, so Aberdeen, Westport, Ocean Shores, bringing these results out there and trying to encourage the community just to think about their future planning. If they're building a new building, where will it be? And think about some of these things when you're doing that planning. So there's a lot of efforts to bring it to the public in various ways. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I'm hoping I can also show you some of these examples. Okay, so someone had asked me before, do these results, I was showing all those simulations of what happens to our buildings, does this actually impact building design? And it has. I don't know if any of you saw this, the Seattle Times did an article on this. So in December 2018, the city of Seattle and the city of Bellevue revised their requirements for how you design tall buildings that are within the Seattle Basin. So this is, again, the outline of the Seattle Basin. You see the city of Seattle right in there, city of Bellevue right in there. So you now have to design your buildings stronger to match what we expect the shaking will be in the Seattle Basin from these simulations. So this is a graphic that the Seattle Times put together. I'm sure it's outdated now. This was December 2018, so maybe 10 months ago. So this is showing the number of buildings that were impacted by this new requirement. It only applied to tall buildings over 240 feet. But you can see in the city of Seattle, there were 116 buildings that were already built that were that height. But the new ones that are going to be impacted by this new design rule, it's about 60. Okay, the smaller number in Bellevue, but those new buildings in Bellevue will also be required to build stronger based on some of this work. Yeah.
So for the existing buildings, are they required to do some type of retrofit?
No. My understanding is that the city of Seattle is trying to, for earthquake safety, they're trying to do something where if you do a significant redesign to your building, you have to build it to a new earthquake standard. I don't know if that has officially passed and is required yet, but no, there's not really a good mechanism for forcing building owners to update older buildings. So really the control that they have is on new buildings.
So I see 19 buildings under construction. That could be a significant cost to go back if the building is...
Oh yeah, there were a lot of unhappy people. Yeah, no, I know. There was actually so this rule went into effect in December 2018, and apparently there was a huge rush to get permits before December 2018 because people knew it was coming. Yeah, you're right. It adds a significant cost.
It's a huge rush to be unsafe.
Right.
Not nice.
Yeah. Okay. The other effort that I'm helping work on is our earthquake early warning system. So this is called Shake Alert. I don't know if any of you have heard of this yet. Have any of you heard of earthquake early warning? A few of you. Okay. So I'm just going to tell you how earthquake early warning works. So let's say this is a fault here. This is a city. All these black dots are seismic stations. So they're little stations that are going to record earthquake ground shaking. So when an earthquake happens, it actually radiates two different types of waves. So there's a P wave that travels faster, but it's actually pretty weak. And then there's an S wave that comes out after, and it's slower, but that's when all the strong ground shaking starts. So if you've ever been in a big earthquake, you might notice that maybe the ground kind of jolts first. That's the P wave. And then things kind of shake around, and then all of a sudden it really starts to shake. So that's the S wave. So these are all the different types of waves coming in. So the way earthquake early warning works is these seismic stations, they feel that jolt. They feel the P wave. And hopefully the seismic stations, if they are between you and the earthquake, Once the seismic station says, ooh, I think I felt a jolt, it can radio ahead a signal to the city before the earthquake strong shaking actually arrives. So this is not earthquake prediction, it's just detecting an earthquake very fast in the hopes of giving a city that's a little bit further away from the earthquake some warning time.
So how much warning time do you have?
So it depends on what the distance is between the earthquake and the city. In some cases, if the earthquake is if it happens right beneath you, you won't get any warning at all. For a Cascadia M9 earthquake, if the first part of the fault to move is, say, offshore southern Oregon, you could have several minutes before it actually the strong ground shaking actually reaches Washington. So it depends. In some cases, it can give you a lot of warning. In some cases, it can give you very little or no warning. So what can Shake Alert, this earthquake early warning system, do? How is it useful? So for people, we say that gives you an extra few seconds to drop cover and hold on. You can move away from hazardous areas. Say if you have the stove on, you can turn it off, move away. You can also secure delicate medical procedures. I always think of this as like the dentist is in my mouth with a sharp tool, that I hope that he has earthquake early warning. He doesn't, but you can imagine that there's a lot of scenarios where that could be useful. For systems, so the BART transit system in San Francisco has actually been using this for years. You can stop or slow trains automatically if you get a message that a seismic station has detected an earthquake. You can stop traffic, you can stop airplanes from landing. You can close, say, gas valves, water pumps, blowers. You can also park delicate machinery. So you can imagine there's a lot of things, even if you only have, say, 3 seconds, if these things are automatic and you don't have to have a person push a button, if the computer just gets a message and it automatically shuts it off, these things can happen very quickly. Okay, so I always like to point this out. So Mexico, Japan, Turkey, Romania, China, Italy, and Taiwan all have earthquake early warning systems. We should really have one. So the US system it costs $40 million to complete. That's adding more seismic stations to kind of fill in all those gaps. And then it would cost $28 million a year to operate, so personnel and replacing equipment as it breaks. That may sound like a lot, but someone recently told me that is only 80% of Russell Wilson's 4-year contract, like over a span of 4 years. So it's maybe not that much. Public alerting. So people in Los Angeles do have earthquake early warning now. So they just released it last year. So about 10 million people now can download an app and get an alert for when an earthquake happens in the LA area. In the Pacific Northwest, we're a little further behind. That's partially because our area is just so much more complicated than California. We have these 3 different types of earthquakes. They don't have that. We have a much wider region to take care of. They don't. So Shake Alert in the Pacific Northwest is still being pilot tested. There's a lot of partners and pilot testers. Some of them, I've put their logos here. And we're hoping over the next year or 2 maybe that these alerts can finally become public. Okay. So I hope that, I know some of this talk can be scary, but I hope I've given you some encouragement here at the end that we are doing a lot. We've made a lot of progress, and we're continuing to make progress towards making the Pacific Northwest a more earthquake safe and resilient place. All right, thank you. I'll take more questions. Yes.
Do you see any pros or cons about the October 17th drill coming out?
What was that?
The October 17th shakeout?
Oh, so there is, the annual shakeout that they do. So every year they do a shakeout drill. So it's kind of like a fire drill, but for earthquakes, where people are encouraged to test various systems. So people like me, I would just kind of go under my desk, practice what I would do if there were an earthquake in my office or my home. But some companies or groups will do larger test drills. No, we encourage those. Those are great. My understanding when I've heard from social scientists is that if you've thought out well what you would do in an earthquake, you're more likely to actually do it. So most people you're not supposed to, but either run outside or freeze when there's an earthquake. But really what you're supposed to do is to drop, cover, and hold on, because most people get hurt when things are falling or when they're trying to run and the ground is shaking. So the best thing to do is to stay in place, get under a heavy table, protect yourself from falling objects. So we always encourage people to think about that, think about what they would do, and that's exactly what the Great Shakeout is trying to do. Yes?
Hi, Aaron. Great presentation. So about 6 years ago, there was a New Yorker article that kind of first, put a whole bunch of emphasis on the region and earthquakes. The estimates back then seemed to be around 250, every 250 to 300 years for M9s, and so have we gotten better in the last 5 years?
Yeah. So actually that article was misleading in that respect. So there is some evidence that every 250 years there might be smaller magnitude 8s in Northern California and Southern Oregon. That geologic evidence is very controversial. But if we take it at face value, say we believe the evidence, then that looks like we have magnitude 8s every 250 years or so. That would not have we would certainly feel it in Washington. It wouldn't have the devastating impact as a magnitude 9. It would be 10 times smaller than a magnitude 9. But the other thing that we sometimes think of is, we know that this earthquake happened in 1700. It's been more than 250 years. I mean, it's not perfect. We always say plus or minus, but the number's a little dubious, and it certainly does not refer to the magnitude 9s. The magnitude 9s are every 500 years. Yeah?
Say a magnitude 9 happens tomorrow, what's the economic damage?
Oh. You should probably ask an economist, but I imagine it's terrible. I mean, sort of like I said before, I think one of the things that distinguishes a magnitude 9 from any of these other earthquakes that we've seen is that it impacts such a large area. Northern California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, so also Canada. And all these have major cities, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver. So I imagine it would be quite bad, especially because you have all these interconnected nearby places that are going to be suffering huge amounts of damage at the same time.
What was the figure on your Fukushima slide?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so for Japan, it was $360 billion of damage for the Tohoku earthquake. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think some of that was certainly the nuclear, but even, I think we could probably maybe expect 100 billion. Yeah, it would be very large. Yes.
Can we predict that, the freeway bridges would go down and that power would go down? And that sort of thing?
So, you're not going to like this answer. It depends. I showed you how much the ground shaking can vary depending on where the earthquake starts. So again, if the earthquake is rupturing away from us and we have fairly weak ground shaking, then I wouldn't expect a whole lot of those things. You would still have the tsunami damage, but the damage from the actual shaking would be quite little. On the other hand, if the earthquake ruptures towards us, then the ground shaking would be extreme and there would be damage like that. So I know it's not a satisfying answer. What we've done with the study is we have put bounds on what to expect, but the bounds are really large. So it's hard to say what the next earthquake will be like.
So there was a couple of decades ago, maybe 25 years ago, that we started hearing about the Puget Sound earthquake scenario.
This Seattle fault earthquake scenario?
Yeah. So does your work inform that? Is there a feedback loop between those two?
I don't know that necessarily feedback loop, but that's our next big project. So the M9 project, this was funded by the National Science Foundation, so it was timely, it was the time to do it. The Seattle fault earthquake is the one that would certainly be more worrisome for Seattle and Bainbridge Island, and that is, I'm actually running those on my computer right now. So invite me back in a year or two, and I'll tell you about that.
So that fault goes from Alki to the southern part of Bainbridge.
Mm-hmm.
Which direction?
Oh, we don't know. We don't know, and that's part of the problem. Is we don't know where earthquakes will start. And where they start determines which direction they rupture towards. And so you have to test all possibilities. And that's what causes all this variability.
Is there any research being done or collaboration being done with the tech companies to develop other types of applications like the Shakeler? And is there any research being done that will inform us in terms of what the recovery scenario will look like in terms of how long it will take them?
Yeah, so there's kind of two parts of your question. So the tech companies are certainly interested in earthquake early warning because they want to protect their business and their operations. So I don't work on getting the funding for earthquake early warning because I'm a government employee, but my understanding is they do have been contributing, I think, some money or resources towards the earthquake early warning efforts. Taking like estimates of recovery in terms of economics or how long it'll take, that starts to get into, we really don't have anyone at the University of Washington or at the USGS that's working on that. A lot of that seems to be left up to like insurance companies at the moment. There's not a great report that I know of that quantifies everything in terms of, say, monetary value.
So there was a report done by, our WashDOT, our Department of Transportation, for instance. The version of that in Oregon did this study. Came out about a year ago. I included it in my book, and I'm trying to think if there's a public place where it's listed too. I'll find it and we'll post it on the website. It gives a grid, and it just looked at the I-5 corridor, and it looked at rebuild times for everything from tarmacs to sewer lines to the highways themselves, all the way through. Some examples were the tarmacs getting rebuilt so that we could bring in outside air resources was 6 months.
But again, that depends on the exact earthquake that happens.
Sure.
Usually these studies, and maybe rightfully so, tend to take like a worst case scenario.
Yeah, I think theirs was an M8 something, which I know that's a big range. I will find that resource for you, and we'll put that on the website. But in general, it's recovery periods measured in months to years, not weeks to months.
Well, the point of that question, I think, is that the tech companies can also be more active in not just the alert system, but also creating products to help people do rapid neighborhood and planning, some kind of software to where people can organize better. And then also systems or creating systems that will help us recover faster.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if they're doing that, but that is a good idea. If they're not doing it, they should be.
Email.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
I'm not a geologist, and I hope since you are.
I'm actually not, but I'm a seismologist. I don't know much geology, but yeah, that's okay.
I looked around online and I couldn't find the answer to this, but again, back to the island versus the mainland. This may sound like a cartoon version, but so Bainbridge is an island. So that means it's free floating and not tethered.
No, it is actually, deep down it is tethered, yeah. Yeah. Really, I think your biggest concern about being an island is that you have water on all sides. So you have to worry about a tsunami or any kind of sloshing effect on all sides. But that should be the extent of it. Yeah, that's right. You have to worry about your bridges are hopefully strong.
They'll go down. Yeah, bridge will go down. In the interest of time, I'm going to close our session for the evening. Good. Thanks. To answer your question earlier about what can we do, I'll give you 3 quick things. First, you can come back tomorrow and learn more. For the question of what can I do, this is interesting information about wildfire and earthquake. What do I do? So, first thing you can do is you can come back tomorrow and you can learn a lot more. Second thing is you can take action now. Do not put it off for a month from now or a year from now. Find out information that you need to act on, such as bringing 2 weeks worth of supplies into your home, and act on that now. Don't put your head in the sand and think, oh, that's too daunting of a list, I can't do anything. Pick one item, pick water, pick first aid, pick food, whichever you like. Pick one item and start now. Second thing you can do is you can throw a party, specifically a Map Your Neighborhood party. You can email our illustrious leader, Pam Sage, at the city, and we have a dozen trainers, 15 trainers?
Little less, about 8.
Okay. We've got other trained citizens like you and me, just normal people like you and me, that have been trained for how to conduct Map Your Neighborhood parties, which sometimes is the first time you would literally talk to your neighbor ever. And you will find out they're a structural engineer or they're a retired nurse. They have good skills that you'll be glad that you now know who they are. So that's the second thing, is to throw a party, have a Map Your Neighborhood party. The third thing is to then get involved. And much of tomorrow will be about getting involved. You'll see a bunch of folks that you know, all up and down City Hall Council. Every type of team, because the earthquake will affect every walk of life, we have literally a team for anything you can think of in life. From how to care for your pets, to how to care for folks with access and functional needs, all the whole gamut. And we would love to have your involvement. And the final thing is you can donate. Lauren has bought us this really cool little dip jar that you dip your credit card into, and it will donate $10, yes, $10, to the nonprofit, and we would greatly appreciate that. So, tomorrow, what time does it start? 2 p.m. And where is it?
Here.
Right here? Okay, see you. Thank you.